Welcome to Barry's in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
Hey, welcome everybody back to In the Interim. I'm Scott Barry, and I'm joined today by my common partner in crime here, Kurt Veely. Dr. Kurt Veely, welcome back to In the Interim.
Thanks, Scott.
Boy, you're showing up enough here on the Interim. You probably don't have a whole lot of alpha left.
I don't. I'm old too. I've done a lot of trials. Who knows?
Yeah.
That's why we got to hire new people. More alpha.
Okay, that's not our topic for today, but that is, people get a sense of what our sense of humor is around here in the Interim. Our topic today may sound dry, but from its guidance documents, and it's specifically the ICH E20 draft guidance on adaptive designs. So my wife, Tammy, listens to all of these. She's the one that listens to all of these. And so we have people like Tammy, who's brilliant, but she doesn't live this every day. So what is the ICH E20? The International Council for Harmonization, that's the ICH, of technical requirements for pharmaceuticals for human use.
That did make it really exciting right there, Scott.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. So the key word of this, I think, is harmonization. And it talks about its mission statement is bringing together regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical industry to discuss scientific and technical aspects of drug registration. And this is really, can they come to a harmonization, an agreement on guidelines for clinical trials interacting with regulators? And an important thing to think about, this is harmonization across regulatory agencies global. EMA, PMDA, FDA, global countries. And so for something to show up here, it's largely agreed upon globally about these guidances. What to add about ICH? The importance of this to some extent.
So I think the important part here is that this is used for potential sponsors, people who are designing trials. This is essentially a document which is saying this is okay, this is mildly controversial, this may be more controversial. Nothing in here says you can or can't do anything, but it's certainly giving, here's the kind of issues we worry about. It provides a structure for how to talk to regulators. This is essentially, it sets up the playing field and essentially says, these are the kind of things that are always in bounds. These are the things that you're going to need more discussion. All of this is vital in when people first walk into I have a trial, what should I do? This kind of documents where it says, here's my options. This is the field I can play in.
Okay. And it says harmonization is achieved through the development of ICH guidelines via a process of scientific consensus with regulatory and industry experts working side by side. So where is this in the process? They wanted to put out a guidance document, an ICH guidance document on adaptive designs. Something, Barry, you and I have been living in this space of adaptive designs. Now, the FDA has a guidance. Regulatory agencies may have guidance, and now this is an international harmonization of guidance in this sense. This is draft, and they're looking for feedback from the industry on their draft guidance. So today we are going to dive into what this draft guidance says, the opinion from people who live the life of adaptive designs, this is what we do, and what our viewpoints on this draft guidance is. So that's the topic today. So Kurt, what's your overall impression when you read this? And by the way, people can go out and get access to this. You can read this. You should. If you're listening to this podcast and you're not Tammy, you should go read this draft guidance.
You should make Tammy read the guidance. That should be a requirement.
Yeah. Let me know if you're successful on that.
Okay.
Okay. So the first time you read it, what did you think?
All right. So first off, this is a really interesting place to be because where we are is the public comment period. So, the natural thing to do is immediately dive into issues. But, I think the big picture is the first place to start. And by and large, this is a great document. This is evidence, a continuation of the FDA having adaptive guidance, the EMA, all of these other places, the fact that we've spent the last 20 years designing these trials. This is now something that all needs to be formalized. There's a wealth of experience, hundreds of adaptive trials out there, probably thousands. I haven't done any kind of census on this. But this is a document that basically says adaptive trials are part of the armament, part of the things that you're meant to be coming with us and we need to discuss. So this is all great. I think the document does a wonderful job of laying out all the issues, all of the pros and cons of adaptive design. It talks about various kinds of designs, group sequentials, enrichment, seamless designs. It talks about platforms to some degree, although there are other guidance documents on that. So this is a thorough, complete document. And I think everybody on the committee should be congratulated. So this is, we're going to talk about our, points where we disagree on occasion. But by and large, this is, 95%, this is wonderful.
So 10 years ago, ICH was silent on adaptive designs. And it doesn't mean we weren't doing them, but to some extent, it's not part of the harmonization. So I agree, the existence of this thing is great. It says, and we'll come to each one of these, but Bayesian can be confirmatory. Simulation is important. Seamless can be confirmatory. Enrichment can be confirmatory. Almost full stop. We can end the podcast, and it says all of those things. Now,
it says even more than that because it says how to do it. I mean, there's layouts. If you do simulation, here's what needs to be in it. Here are the issues you need to discuss with regulators. It limits the surprises and de-risk the process for sponsors to adopt these methods.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go into, should we go into the various pieces of this within it? What were potential negatives? One of the negatives for me when reading it is a little bit of the tone to it, a little bit. And a really good example is back in 2010, the FDA came out with a draft guidance on adaptive designs, and it was felt to be challenging. And they came out with the phrase that some designs are less well understood. And that phrase, that four-word phrase, for some people was negative. Oh, it's less well understood. You can't do this. It's a struggle. It didn't bother me when I read that. Let's make it understood. That's part of our job sort of thing in it. So are there similar things here to perhaps the tone of it in your read that could be construed to be similar to that less well understood?
So on the plus side, I think there's less of that. I think there's some of that lesson has been learned. Maybe that lesson is now well understood about how much a document influences practice indirectly. I think to me, in terms of the language, issues like things are very hard or impossible, things that I know that we've done and we've gotten accepted, I think are phrased as, oh, this is going to be incredibly difficult and we know it's not. So I think that would be valuable to try to get rid of some of that and to more talk about the issues.
Yep. Okay. All right. And the other really important thing I should touch on, the existence of it. Is there anything this document says you can't do when you're doing a design of an adaptive trial?
No. And I mean, we should keep in mind that there's nothing anywhere that says, I know more about the FDA's legal basis than other regulatory agencies, but there's nothing in the law that says you have to be frequentist versus Bayesian. There's nothing in the law that says 0.025. There are standards that, this is an easier path than others, but nowhere does anything say no to anything.
Yep. Which is a really important thing. I don't find this restrictive at all. I'm not going to be involved with the design of a trial and alter it because of what this says overall.
Yeah, I think this is really about where are you on the adoption cycle for adaptive trials. If you're on the bleeding edge, this document's probably irrelevant to you. It doesn't say no, you're going to stay on the bleeding edge. This document is an invitation for people a little farther back to go, adaptive designs are now stable enough, acceptable enough that another group of people can hop on board.
Okay, so on the grand scheme, this is an intangible summary from you of this particular document. The original FDA draft guidance document, 2010, I think it was, I think generally was perceived to be a lot of caution, and generally the people on the edge of this doing adaptive designs, it wasn't going to stop them, but it didn't feel like an invitation. The current full adaptive design guidance by the FDA is almost saying you should be doing some of these. Some of these things are better, and it's going to supply better ways for us to make decisions on your treatments. It was almost kind of a kick in the butt, if you will. So it was moving the swath of people to saying, boy, we better know what's going on here. We better do this kind of thing. That maybe that's the sort of scale of it's very encouraging. You should be doing this. It's gonna change the industry, to caution, and people are going to use it as, well, if you read this guidance document, I don't think people want you to do this kind of thing. Where do you find this on that scale?
This is probably a little closer to 2010, but it's also, a few changes, and it moves closer to the other document. So this isn't substance. This is, as you said, tone. So I think in terms of, let's talk about, for example, a bias discussion. There's discussions of, if you do this or that, you could run into biased estimates and on. And all this is fair. I certainly, unbiased, I think is important. Quality of estimates is important. I'm not sure unbiased is, the most important thing in every setting. But this is a situation where, you could have a tone where, all these horrible things might happen. But, we respond to FDA and EMA questions on this. We quantify what the bias is. It's not that much. And things are acceptable, or we need to make small changes. So it's not a roadblock. It's something to be aware of.
Yep. Okay, so let's sort of dive into the various pieces of this. In terms of adaptive designs, it goes through different parts of different kinds of adaptive trials. So, by the way, this does make a reference that this is largely for confirmatory trials. So we should be thinking this late stage. There's one comment in there that I do really not like that says that this guidance is also relevant for early trials. And I think there's a lot of places it's completely misplaced, that this isn't really guidance and it doesn't make sense in that. But so think about this as phase 3 trials for registration of this. So it talks about seamless trials. What do you think about the discussion it has about seamless trials?
So you got to read that 2 or 3 times, I think. So the seamless trial discussion, it talks about in some detail trials that say have 2 doses and you do a dose selection and narrow it down. It doesn't talk about trials where, what we would consider the more general seamless, where you're combining a phase 2 dose finding and a phase 3 confirmatory trial where you've got lots of doses. And it has a couple really negative statements in there. I think it says adaptive trials shouldn't be a replacement for a proper dose-finding trial. I think this is one of my places I really would like to see this changed. A seamless trial, the fundamental advantage that we see, and this goes back to, I could probably give the broader picture. If you separate these trials, what companies will do is they'll spend a little bit of time in phase 2 so they can move to phase 3 as quickly as possible. When they do that, you're more likely to get the wrong dose. When it's a seamless trial, you actually spend more time in phase 2. You can do the math. You should spend more time in phase 2 because you get to use the data. You make better decisions. So I would say a seamless 2-3 trial, not always, we should have a discussion, but in many cases, it's a more proper dose ranging trial and gets the information that regulators want. It has more information about what is the right dose.
Yeah, so there's snuck in there some phrases that just feel sort of cautionary, like saying if you do a seamless 2-3 trial, you might have to do a proper dose ranging trial, as though that's not proper. So a few words like that go away, and it's overly, you can do seamless 2-3 trials. And I agree, that's the part where in some sense, it also says that the goal of adaptive designs is to be more efficient. And it almost sort of brings out this aspect that it's not bad. You're not going to get better answers. You're just going to do it with less resources. And I think you gave a great example of where you actually get better answers with this. I'll throw a trial out there where I think this exactly happened. The Sepsis Act trial was a trial in sepsis. Ferring was the sponsor. They published a paper on the design. It was a seamless 2-3 trial with 4 doses in phase 2, going to phase 3 where it picks a single dose. Because the data in phase 2 was going to be included in the final analysis, and that's what a seamless trial is. It moves from multiple doses to a single dose, but you can use the data in the first part in the confirmation. Because that data was used in the confirmation, they made the phase 2 part larger. And it's actually a trial that, because it was larger, it stopped for futility and didn't go to phase 3. Interesting, if you go into the interim of where that trial was and you go back to a small trial they might have run, they might have jumped and run a very large phase 3 trial inappropriately and failed this large phase 3 trial. They got better answers by being adaptive in that circumstance. This isn't, there are efficiencies, but it's an example of a trial where I think you get better answers by being adaptive.
Well, in a lot of trials like this, we go, hey, if I do this in the standard way, I can only explore 3 doses. If those efficiencies, we don't always trade them for sample size. We trade them to answer a more complete question, explore 5 doses, whatever you need to do here.
Yep. And if I have to do fixed randomization and I add a dose, it linearly increases the size of the trial. If I do adaptations over there, seamless 2-3, response adaptive randomization, I might explore more doses. And we have examples of that as well, where Eli Lilly did 7 doses exploring Trulicity, where the original design was 3 in a fixed trial, but because of response adaptive randomization, they could explore 7 within that circumstance. So multiple examples of that. So I think it's a case where, first of all, they talk about seamless being confirmatory. That's great, but there's a few hidden adjectives we would love to see removed. Okay. What about Bayesian? Does it talk about Bayesian in the guidance?
So yes and no. So I have strong opinions about the Bayesian. I noticed you didn't lead with that. But so the Bayesian trial, it is, there's a section on it. There's a brief introduction to Bayes in general, defines it as basically updating data with a prior and so on. And then it moves to borrowing of external trial data, which, going back to the seamless trial, it's kind of odd. If you say you can't do seamless, you're saying you can't borrow in that context, but you could borrow external data into your phase 3 trial, but you can't borrow from phase 2 that was randomized in the same. Anyway, it's an odd, it doesn't flow right. So, but the Bayesian, one thing that's important to me when you get into borrowing, Bayesian is not equal to borrowing. There are lots of ways to be a frequentist and do borrowing. We don't tend to do those, so I'm not expert in them, but they exist, and they certainly do nice things. Bayesian do borrowing, and there's lots to Bayesian that is not borrowing, and that's given short shrift there. I think there ought to be discussions on hierarchical models for modeling subgroups, predictive probabilities, those kind of things. Bayesian should not only be informative priors. There are lots of other applications.
Yep. In that. So generally, when you read that section, and by the way, that's done by others. A lot of times people contact us and say, we want to do a Bayesian trial. And what they mean is an adaptive trial, in that it's not necessarily driven by Bayesian statistical models, in that many of them are, which is why that tying those things together happen. And many times I suspect when people come to the agencies about potentially borrowing, they're probably bringing a Bayesian with them. And that there's ways in which these things kind of get tied together, but agree completely they're separate topics. Overall, what was your view of their discussion of Bayes?
So I thought with the idea that it needs to be expanded for the Bayes part, the borrowing part I liked. It has a reasonable discussion of what you need to worry about. I am not anti-type 1 error, so I'm okay with the discussion of that as well. I think it ought to be there. I think there's a discussion, when we go to the agency with these trials, a lot of times we don't even argue the statistics. We argue, is the data we want to borrow from relevant? And that's certainly in this document. So I think it says, here are the issues you ought to discuss, and these are the issues that we've discussed in the past. And borrowing is sometimes appropriate and sometimes not.
I thought it was, in some ways, I think it's relatively weak. There's not a lot there. That's not bad in it. Again, it's not restrictive in it. It exists. And this is a harmonization. So in some ways, this is the factors that largely agreed upon regulatory agencies globally is that Bayes is confirmatory. I mean, its existence in that, that's a really important thing in that. And it being not overly prescriptive, I think is actually pretty good in there. I thought it was opening the idea of borrowing as a very reasonable thing. I think, by the way, if forecasting forward, that's something that's going to be done much more. Now, it's not always borrowing things we already know about historically. It's a trial of 4 baskets that I'm prospectively going into 4 subsets of disease, and I want to borrow from one subset to another. I think this is pretty open to that idea as a very reasonable thing to do.
So I read it as well, and I think here's where it's worth a little bit more language, because part of the language in there on, say, bias and estimation is a little bit at odds with Bayes. I mean, to me, working in adaptive trials for the last 15 years, or however it has been 15 years. Oh, you're right. Anyway, it's been 15 years. But anyway, the greatest advantage to Bayes when you're doing adaptive trials is the posterior distribution is the posterior distribution. You don't have to worry about correcting. You don't have to worry about what the design is. You don't need these different corrections all over the place. The posterior is the posterior, the inferences are the inferences, and you're done. However, from a strict frequentist standpoint, those are biased in some respect. And I think there ought to be some discussion that we ought to be trying to get good estimates. And especially in adaptive trials, that should be a focus on mean square error and not necessarily bias is the only thing or the preeminent thing in the world.
Yeah. Yep. Agreed. Okay. You talked about enrichment trials being in there. Anything specifically about enrichment trials?
I like what's there. I do think it ought to, this is the same with seamless. It talked about 2 doses and not the full seamless. The enrichment section, it talks about essentially biomarker positive and negative, and that's the focus. We do a lot of trials, rare oncology, rare tumor types in oncology, where we may look at 10 different cancers and we want to borrow among them. The ROAR trial, for example, was the first pan-tumor approval for FDA at least, where you got a drug that was targeted to anything that had the right mechanism, the right target for the mechanism to act on. I do think the enrichment section should talk about those kind of trials. And this gets into the estimation again. We know if we look at multiple groups, the highest of the high is biased high, and hierarchical models to correct that. That's an important part of this. Again, getting good estimates, not necessarily unbiased, isn't necessarily the best estimate.
Yep. And it tied in this idea. So we do a lot of adaptive designs where we've been told no by a regulator because we haven't yet convinced them of type 1 error. I mean, this is a red line to some extent. That we have had trials where we know type 1 error is inflated, and that's been okay too. So I'm not saying that every single trial is that way, but that's a very strong thing. Maybe this is a bad thing to say, but I've never, and we supply estimation summaries in almost every one of our simulation reports. We look at the behavior of the estimation. And I don't think we've ever been told no because of the behavior of the estimation.
Well, I think in general, we want the shrinkage does reasonable things. We actually run into the opposite problem where we run a basket trial. One of the baskets, the drug performs incredibly well. We shrink it down, and we can run into debates over, I don't want the estimate to be less. Hey, I want to be able to put a big number on there. But we go, hey, this is the highest of the high. It's biased high. It should come down.
Yep. And in some scenarios, we know that the estimate of the highest group is going to be biased. I mean, that's the whole role of the particular shrinkage of that. It does spend a good bit of time on two other topics, and the FDA does as well. Operational bias and the role of that, the role of blinding and all of that. What do you think about its discussion about the implementation about adaptive designs, ensuring blinding and those aspects?
I think those are great. I think, if I have comments, they're all minor. It lays out issues. It talks about communication flows, emphasizes you don't want data to get to the wrong places. It discusses what I would consider maybe esoteric topics for TAMI in terms of if a sponsor needs access to certain information, there needs to be blinded firewalls in place, to make sure it doesn't negatively affect the study. There's discussions of interim analysis committees. I think it's very thorough. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I do too. And largely agree with it. And making sure that's done really well, I think, is important for adaptive designs. So it also discusses what we call an adaptive design report, a report that summarizes and describes in complete detail the adaptive design and the simulations conducted around the design. What did you think about its description of the need for this, the components of this in the ICH?
I think, so this is another one of my sections I think is really done well. I think it lays out tons of issues, talks about different scenarios, has important points like, plausible scenarios rather than all scenarios. So there's the famous example we've talked about in other podcasts where we were asked to simulate when people become immortal under certain conditions, which I think is, largely a time past. But this document is in the present, so it does that well. It has a few throwaway statements in it. I don't know if they're throwaway or not, but it's essentially, this is impossible to do under certain conditions. And I would prefer that this gets back to less well understood. I'm worried about somebody just pointing to that and going, they wrote 10 pages on this, but they really only meant the one sentence that says this is impossible. That's the secret code that tells us not to read the other 10 pages and pay any attention to it. Sometimes this is hard. Sometimes the null space is hard to explore. And, we need to be transparent about that. But in a number of cases, a dichotomous response, look at a grid of probabilities and you've done what you needed to do.
This is another place, if we go back to, there's an ICH E20 guidance that says simulation for demonstration of type 1 error is a thing you can do. It's a scientifically reasonable thing, and it says it in the ICH E20. It's draft. But that's another place that, looking back over the years, that's been a controversial thing for years. And it was never in the FDA. The question is this, and now it's in the ICH E20. The progress that's been made in this, that's another place we don't want to ignore, that this is a super positive thing that's in it.
Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple things that we kind of disagree with. I'll call them little myths, for example, that I'm not sure are grounded. Don't do a lot of interims. There are people that have this viewpoint that, you should only do one interim. And we get people that tell us, oh, you shouldn't do 2 interims. Regulators don't like that. Now, it doesn't tell you can't do 6 interims in it, but it gives this feeling that generally interims are bad if you read that statement. In that, and I understand the notion that and it's interesting, for a long time, and Don has said this, that if you do 1 interim, it might actually be something that supplies a certain amount of information about what's going on. If you were to, at the other extreme, do interims every day, there's almost nothing that's ever learned by anybody because it's just continually going on within this. So it's always a statement I've found odd, and I'm not sure it's actually real, but it's repeated by people. So there's a couple things like that show up in the document as well.
And one thing I think so things that aren't myths, that are cautionary in this document, I think we ought to make sure we echo in this podcast. There's a discussion about there is some limit on how many adaptations and so on you can do. Now, we certainly aren't on the side of, hey, 3 interims as opposed to 1 is exceeding the limit. That's not what we would call the budget. But certainly the document raises a good point. If you're talking about a platform trial, the model's changing, there's different protocols at different sites, lots of things can be very complex. We've at some level experimented with experimenting. And I think it should be fair. We've walked at the end of the trial and said, hey, that was maybe too complex. It didn't do exactly what we wanted it to do. But this should be part of the discussion. I don't think anyone should take this as, don't do 2 interims or don't do 2 things. Do a factorial design with early stopping, but don't throw in everything in the toolbox at once is fair.
Yep. And I do think that's fair. That touches on another topic that I'm interested in your viewpoint on this. It does give the viewpoint that you should justify why you're doing, say, an adaptive design. Now, I think some people might take the viewpoint of, what, does somebody have to justify they're doing a fixed trial? Why do I have to justify a scientifically credible thing? What's your take on that general sentiment in the document?
So I'm in favor of that sentiment in the document. I do think, if we're talking about non-adaptive trials, they're easier to implement. They're usually easier for people to write up, to understand. If you get into corrections for estimation from a frequentist standpoint, there are complexities that come with an adaptive trial. If you are going to get exactly the same, so at the end of the day, patients are going to be treated essentially the same chance they get a good drug, the same chance they mistakenly get a bad drug. If all of that's the same, and that includes time, correct choice of dose, there's a lot more into it than power and type 1 error. If those are all the same, definitely go simple. You need to say, here is the advantage that justifies the cost of doing an adaptive design. Often that's in adaptive's favor, but we know, if accrual's fast, not time to be adaptive, for example. There are exceptions to adaptive wins.
The other part of that, and I'm completely fine with that as well, there's one challenge to it, but one other part is we don't decide on a design. We don't throw in adaptive things because, it would be cool to do that, or we're showing off. We've gone through a sequence of comparisons with the design team. We've said, here's what you could do with this. We always start with a fixed design. Here's a fixed design. Now we start to add adaptations. We've done all those comparisons. We've demonstrated the advantages that this design supplies in it. So I think it's a very reasonable thing. One of the challenges that I've always found with this is we go through this iteration of the design where we do lots of comparisons to other designs. And what if we do RAR with different frequency? What if we don't do it? And it's hard to present that entire story of comparisons to regulators of the designs we're not running. So we walk in and we say, this is the design here. I know it relies upon us to explain the value of the things we're doing on that. But it's a little bit harder at the end of the story to provide all of that story.
And we've had confusions where regulators have said back, essentially they have brought up reasonable issues about designs we're not proposing because they're often those comparisons. It can be confusing. So, it's a cautionary tale to lay those out carefully and make sure we know what the default is. Now, I will say on that issue, my pet peeve is the one where it says Bayesian has to be justified. Adaptive, I think there's a cost to being adaptive that needs to be justified in terms of the extra effort operational. Bayes and frequentist, that's not the same thing. This is just two different ways of being inference. I would call this the Animal Farm argument of statistical paradigms. Frequentist is equal, but frequentist is more equal than Bayes. So this, I don't object to that one.
It's good. I should have asked you your pet peeve. You have a pet peeve of each episode. Okay, good one. Okay, other topics I missed on the guidance. Draft guidance.
I think we've actually done pretty well going through it. As I said, I think we should come back to the positives here and just how much of this document we agree with. I think we agree with virtually everything they say. You should justify the following aspects. We agree. These are the pros and cons. We agree. It's a lot of the adjectives around it that we're reticent of. Essentially, people who are involved in regulatory consulting going, this is what this means. It's, this is the sentence that invalidates the rest of the document. And we've been through that often enough. We'd like it to focus on the issues.
Yep. The regulators don't think a seamless 2-3 trial is proper. And weird things like that. So largely, I agree. I think I read this and it was a little bit of, are we going to get here? And I thought it was largely a very positive document in that. So congratulations to everybody that worked on it. I know consensus and harmonization, yikes in this. And so congratulations to them. Is Barry planning to provide a response to this? If they've invited responses, are we planning to provide a response?
Yeah, we're definitely going to provide our own response. We're also interested. I know other groups are working on responses as well. We're happy to collaborate on those responses. So certainly, we're going to make sure that we express where we would like to make changes. And I think we've covered a lot of our big topics today.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. So thank you, Kurt, for joining. Thanks for weighing in on this. And here in the interim, and remember, we're always in the interim of science and life. So here we are. Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you.